Mark was never a man of superstitions. He always believed in logic, in what he could see and touch, and laughed at the ghost stories his sister Sarah used to tell when they were kids. So, when he inherited the old family house after their father's death, he didn't hesitate to accept it. To him, it was just an old building in need of renovation, but Sarah refused to step inside. "This house has a heavy feeling," she said, holding the key without the courage to turn it in the lock. Mark didn't. Listen, ever since they were children, Sarah had always had a strange sensitivity to places and presences, something he had never taken seriously. Ignoring her warnings, he started cleaning the place, throwing out old furniture, ripping down moldy curtains, and scrubbing the floors, until under a worn-out rug in the living room he found something he had never seen before: a hatch. It was made of dark wood, reinforced with iron bands corroded by time, and covered with symbols carved in an irregular manner. Mark frowned. He had grown up in that house, had run through those rooms countless times as a child, but he had no memory of ever seeing that hatch. How could something like that have gone unnoticed for so long? Driven by curiosity, he tried pulling it open, but the lid wouldn't budge. He grabbed a crowbar and forced the locks, then a hammer, pounding on the rusted iron, but nothing worked. The hatch seemed sealed, not just physically, but as if something beyond mere wood was keeping it shut. Frustrated, Mark decided to leave it for later, but that night, as he lay on the makeshift mattress on the living room floor, he heard a sound that sent a chill down his spine, murmurs coming from beneath the floor. Mark held his breath and remained still, his eyes fixed on the dark ceiling of the room. Maybe it was just the old wood creaking, the wind whistling through the cracks in the windows. But as the seconds passed, he realized the sounds weren't random. They were whispers, low at first, indistinct, as if someone was speaking underwater. Then, gradually, they became clearer, more defined. Fragmented words, spoken in a language he didn't recognize, intertwined in a continuous hum. A cold wave ran down his spine. Swallowing hard, he sat up and pointed the flashlight of his phone at the floor. The murmurs stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like it had sucked all the sound from the room. Mark stayed there, motionless, waiting for something else to happen, but the house remained quiet. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. He forced himself to lie down again, convincing himself that by morning it wouldn't seem so strange. But as soon as he closed his eyes, the whispers started again, and this time they sounded closer. The next morning, Mark decided not to mention anything to Sarah. He knew she would use it as proof that the house was wrong, and insist that he leave. Instead, he grabbed his phone and placed it on the floor near the hatch, activating the audio recorder. If those sounds were real, he would have proof. He left the phone there while he had his coffee, and after a few minutes he picked up the device to check the recording. His fingers slid across the screen hastily, and he pressed play, expecting to hear the whispers that had echoed the night before. But all that came out of the speaker was static. No voices, no murmurs. Just white noise. Mark frowned. He knew what he had heard. He knew it wasn't just in his head. But if the sounds were real, why hadn't they been captured by the recording? That night, the whispers returned. Only this time they didn't stop when he shined his flashlight at the floor. Mark sat up, gripping the phone in his hands, heart pounding in his chest. The murmurs were clearer now, almost rhythmic, as if reciting something. He strained to make out the words, but they twisted and slithered in his ears, evading comprehension. His pulse quickened. A sudden noise made him flinch, a soft thump from across the room. His gaze darted toward the furniture. One of the chairs had moved. It wasn't much, just a few inches from where it had been before, but Mark was sure of it. He hadn't touched it. No drafts, no open windows. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts as he felt something shift in the room, a presence pressing against the air itself. The whispers grew louder, crawling under his skin like a fever. The hatch remained shut, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath it was awake, and it knew he was listening. Determined to prove to himself that he wasn't going insane, he called his friend Chris the next morning. Chris was the kind of guy who approached everything with skepticism, the kind of person Mark needed to keep him grounded. "Dude, you need to spend the night here," Mark said over the phone, trying to sound casual. "I swear this place is playing tricks on me." Chris laughed, thinking it was a joke at first, but eventually agreed to come over. That evening, as they sat in the dimly lit living room with beers in hand, Mark recounted everything. The whispers, the hatch, the chair that had moved on its own. Chris listened, skeptical but intrigued. "All right, let's hear it then," he said, leaning back in the creaky wooden chair. Mark waited, staring at the floor. The silence stretched long, oppressive, and then, just as Chris was about to speak, the murmurs started again. His smirk faded. He sat up straight, gripping his beer. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Mark didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both heard it. Chris swallowed hard, his eyes locked onto the floor as if expecting it to break open at any moment. The whispers were unmistakable, low, layered, almost chanting. Mark watched as his friend's confident demeanor faded, replaced by unease. "All right," Chris muttered, setting his beer down carefully, as if any sudden movement might provoke whatever was beneath them. "That's weird." He leaned forward, placing a hand on the floor. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to react, shifting in tone, growing sharper, more insistent. "Dude, this isn't the house settling. This is something else." Mark nodded slowly. "I told you." He picked up his phone again, hit the record button, and let it capture the sound for a full minute. When he played it back, the same static filled the room. No voices, no whispers, just the dull hiss of nothingness. Chris exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "That's impossible. We both heard it." Determined to figure out what they were dealing with, they decided to test the hatch. Grabbing a crowbar, Chris knelt beside it and pressed the metal tip under the edge, grunting as he pushed down. Nothing. Mark tried next, adding his strength, but it was like trying to pry open solid concrete. "Jesus," Chris huffed, wiping his forehead. "It's not just stuck, it's like sealed." Mark stared at the strange carvings in the wood, running his fingers over them. "I think it's meant to stay shut," he murmured. Chris stood, pacing. "So what? You think it's locked with magic or something?" Mark didn't answer. He didn't want to say it out loud, but the thought had already rooted itself in his mind. Something was keeping that hatch closed, and if it had to be sealed, then maybe, just maybe, there was something inside that wasn't meant to come out. That night, the atmosphere in the house was different. It wasn't just the whispers. The air itself felt charged, thick, like walking through a room right before a thunderstorm. Chris, despite his skepticism, refused to sleep alone. "I'm crashing on the couch," he announced. "Screw your haunted-ass guest room." Mark didn't argue. Around midnight, just as Mark was starting to drift off, the sound of scraping wood jolted him awake. He sat up fast, heart hammering. The whispers had returned, louder than ever. Chris was already awake, his eyes wide, staring at the furniture. Every single chair in the room had moved, not by inches this time, but in a circle surrounding the hatch. The realization hit them both at the same time. The house wasn't just haunted, it was trying to keep something inside. Panic set in. "Mark," Chris whispered, barely breathing. "What the hell is going on?" Mark couldn't answer. He could barely think. The whispers weren't distant anymore. They were under the hatch, rising, almost frantic, and then suddenly they stopped. The silence was worse. It was suffocating, waiting. Then a deep, guttural thump echoed from below. One single knock. Mark felt something inside him twist. He didn't want to see what was beneath that hatch. He needed to get out of that house. Chris grabbed his arm. "We have to leave now." Mark hesitated. The rational part of his brain was screaming for him to run, to burn the place down if necessary, but another part, something darker, something curious, wanted to know why this was happening. Why had his father never spoken about this? Had he known? Had he lived with these sounds, these whispers? A horrifying thought crept into Mark's mind. What if he had locked something away? What if that thing had been waiting all these years for someone to find it? Chris didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed Mark's arm and yanked him toward the door. As they ran, the house seemed to breathe, the walls creaking, the floor shuddering beneath their feet. The moment they stepped outside, everything went still. The air was cold and crisp, the night completely silent. No whispers, no movement, nothing. Chris bent over, hands on his knees, gasping. "Jesus, Jesus, man." Mark turned back, staring at the house. It looked the same, just an old quiet home, but he knew better now. Sarah was right. Mark didn't go back inside that night. He and Chris drove to a motel a few miles away, neither speaking for a long time. When they finally did, it was Chris who broke the silence. "You can't stay there, dude." Mark just nodded. He already knew that, but something gnawed at the edges of his mind. He needed to understand what was in that house. So the next day, while Chris refused to step foot anywhere near the place, Mark did something else. He researched. The symbols on the hatch weren't random. After hours of digging through obscure forums and old texts, he found a match. They resembled binding runes, ancient markings meant to trap something inside. The weight in his chest grew heavier. If someone had sealed whatever was beneath the floor, it meant someone had put it there on purpose. But what was worse? The idea that it had been locked away, or the fact that it had been whispering to him. Mark stood at the threshold of the house that afternoon, hesitating before stepping inside. The living room was exactly as they had left it, except for one detail: the chairs. They were no longer in a circle. They had returned to their places. It was as if the house had reset itself, as if it wanted him to come back. Mark's hands clenched into fists. He wasn't sure what was worse, that the house was alive, or that whatever was beneath that hatch was waiting. He turned and left. He didn't lock the door. He didn't pack. He didn't want to know. Some things aren't meant to be opened. Some secrets are supposed to stay buried. Mark never returned to that house, but sometimes when he tries to sleep, he swears he can still hear the whispers, calling, waiting.